The origins of the coronavirus pandemic has perplexed government scientists, the scientific community, and the public alike, but recent investigative reporting does help confirm long-held suspicions that COVID may have come from a lab leak at Wuhan. And I went further in my radar yesterday to say that a lab leak is now the leading likely explanation for COVID-19's origins.
But new reporting from the New York Times reveals that U.S. intelligence agencies are no closer to reaching a consensus on how the pandemic started. As we wait for the Biden administration to release declassified documents detailing what started the spread, officials say there is no smoking gun. Here to dive deeper into this is investigative journalist who's written extensively about lab accidents, Alison Young, author of Pandora's Gamble, Lab Leaks, Pandemics, and the World at Risk. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to someone who is authoritatively written not just about this particular lab leak, but the problem more broadly with lab leaks. First and foremost, what do you make of the government's position that they are unlikely to ever find a definitive smoking gun? And do you think that finding these patient zero is a smoking gun of sorts?
I hope that we are able to find the origins of this pandemic. It is so important. And one of the things I found in researching Pandora's Gamble is that history is pretty instructive that over time, when lab accidents happen, labs go to extraordinary lengths to keep that information secret. And one of the cases that I focus on in Pandora's Gamble involves an anthrax outbreak tied to a lab in the former Soviet Union. And it took 15 years for that case to be determined.
Right. That is a fascinating case. It's actually the one, when I heard about it, I read about it, it was referenced in an article, talking about potential lab leak of COVID. Because that's what caused me to think. I wondered, has this ever happened before? I don't know. I don't know anything about this. And then I read that, actually, yes, pathogens have escaped labs in the past. You said there are, it's taken a long time in many of those cases to understand what happens. Talk to us more about, in your research, the elaborate steps that the institutions involved, the scientific community, the governments in charge of those labs have taken to, muddy the waters.
One of the things the public doesn't realize is that accidents occur on a regular basis in biological research facilities. And the reality is that the people working in those facilities are human beings. They're going to have incidents where they splash infectious fluids on themselves, where equipment malfunctions, where an infected animal may bite them. There have been incidents where wastewater has been released from facilities, including here in the United States. And when these incidents occur, they routinely are shrouded in secrecy. And the labs that have these accidents often go to these great lengths to keep the information secret.
So the Wall Street Journal has reported, confirmed independent reports, that these 3 scientists at the Wuhan lab contracted COVID or very similar to COVID symptoms in November 2019, which is before the outbreak at the wet market. The government obviously has not yet confirmed that intelligence or declassified it. It seems to me extraordinarily likely to be correct, although I guess there's still a world where the report in the Wall Street Journal is theoretically could be wrong. But if the government does confirm that or fails to disprove it, I am having a hard time imagining a world where that's not the most likely origin for COVID. If they got sick before any known other outbreaks out in the world, and it was the very people doing the research you would most worry about having been the origin for COVID, if it can be confirmed that they did get sick, does not a lab leak become sort of a, maybe not definitively proven, but a more likely or a default assumption?
There have been numerous media reports in the last couple of weeks citing unnamed intelligence sources saying that there were these 3 researchers tied to the Wuhan Institute of Virology who were involved with coronavirus research, who came down with unspecified symptoms that could be potentially seasonal illnesses like influenza, which would be circulating at the time, but also could be COVID-19. And it is absolutely instrumental that this information come out through direct government sources. One of the challenges throughout this entire COVID-19 pandemic has been that little information has been released about the origins of COVID. And there has been this push to try to get information about what links the Wuhan Institute of Virology may have to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are still waiting for the declassified intelligence that Congress unanimously said needed to be released. And President Biden signed the bill that called for its release. But we're now past deadline on that information coming out to the public.
And do you have any theory of why that might be the case, that it hasn't been released yet? Are they're just a few days behind? You know, I keep hearing reports that it's about to come out, And will they simply, redact so much or instead release a report summarizing the intelligence they have instead of the actual intelligence?
Those are all the questions I think that all of us are asking right now, is what is going to be in those released documents? Is it going to provide us any new details? Will it be so vague as to not have specific information? There has been some reporting, including a piece that you referenced in the New York Times, that talks about there being no smoking gun, that the information may not answer the questions that people are seeking answers to. But I think that the legislation was clear that specific pieces of information, especially about these reportedly sick workers, is supposed to be included in what's released. So we can hope that we get some more details this week.
Alison, you made reference to another lab leak incident where the smoking gun didn't come till 15 years later. There has, in this instance of the COVID-19 pandemic, been a lot of discussion about how, well, if too much time elapses, we're just not going to know. So help us understand what kind of evidence can come forward 15 years down the line that is dispositive. What would the smoking gun ultimately look like?
In the case that I referenced that was in the former Soviet Union, there had been an effort to claim that outbreak of anthrax was tied to tainted black market meat that people had consumed. And what had happened over time is that there had been scientists and others who hid away evidence so that it could not be confiscated by the KGB. And only after the politics changed were they able to release that information. And it's also informative because some of the leading scientists in the United States who stood up at that time with that anthrax outbreak and said, the evidence from our colleagues, our Russian colleagues, are saying that this is a foodborne illness outbreak. It looks like that's what happened here. They ultimately changed their minds 15 years later as more of the documents and data that had been hidden away came forward.
Yeah, that's very, very fascinating, because one of the concerns here, obviously, is that if COVID was the result of a lab leak in Wuhan, specifically that patient zero having Ben Hugh having done research that was being funded by the U.S., the grants from NIH, NIAID, et cetera, that similarly there will not be an incentive for the U.S. health officials to, they're going to prefer every other explanation, because if it's the lab leak, there is in fact some blame, theoretically tremendous blame, to be had by the U.S. officials as well. So should we be concerned that that's going to lead to something like a cover-up? Have you seen examples of that? The malincentives of the investigators or even the U.S. government in previous lab leaks?
One of the issues that I document in numerous case studies throughout Pandora's Gamble is the conflict of interest that occurs in the oversight of biological research labs is very fragmented. But where there are government agencies that are overseeing this research, they often are performing their own research, or funding the research that they're overseeing. And there have been calls for a number of years that there needs to be in the United States some sort of an independent oversight body that looks at the safety of biological research.
Well, thank you, Alison Young, so much for joining us. I encourage everyone to check out the book, which is Pandora's Gamble. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.